Hi, welcome to session 3 of the third topic of the semester titled The Socioeconomic Transformations of the Late 19th Century in the US. So in this session, session 3, what we're going to do is now look at the West, at the so-called American West, or this, as it was known back then, the Wild West, okay, using 19th century lingo. Or terminology. Again, because it's considered wild because this is a region that Americans had not yet settled or developed into territories and states, with very few exceptions. We're actually going to look at in just a few moments the only sections of this region called the West that Americans had already been moving into and developing territories, and eventually a couple of states were actually developed in this region. But when you look at the entire section, again, from the midsection, we say the Great Plains, again, what today is the Great Plains in the United States, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, with the only exceptions of Oregon and California. Those were actually areas that were, for the most part, undeveloped. That is to say, Americans had not yet moved there in a significant way to develop enterprises or settlements, communities, etc. Again, so we're going to pay attention now to this region and look at these transformations, at the social and economic changes that this region experienced in the late 19th century, as it was now modernizing. In other words, Americans were now bringing modernity, so to speak, trying to develop this region, settle it, and then, of course, create enterprises that are going to transform the landscape altogether of this region in a way that in the terms or in the words used by Americans during this time, they're going to actually civilize. In other words, they're going to actually civilize the Wild West, and they're going to create a whole new West. So let us turn to our slides so we can have now the visual. Again, let me actually maximize here the visual here so we can have a more readable, again, text, and of course to amplify the map so you can actually see, again, the region that we're actually talking about here. So we already covered in session 1 the modernization and development of the North, looking at the new American city. And then in session 2, we looked at the South, the transformation of the old South into a new South, and those transformations took place thanks to industrialization. Again, there was an industrial revolution taking place. When we talk about industrialization after the Civil War in the United States, it is often referred as the Second Industrial Revolution in the United States. So we looked at how the Second Industrial Revolution, the rise of new industries, transformed the life of the United States, particularly Northerners, Americans living in the upper states, in the Northeast and the Midwest. Most of them actually were moving now into cities, living in large cities that were very ethnically and culturally diverse. And again, this is now going to be the primary setting again for Americans, again, in which they're going to actually create communities. They're going to actually experience their lives, earn their living again inside of those cities. The vast majority, we're talking about at least 70% of Northerners by the turn of the century, by 1900, are going to be living again in cities. And Southerners, we explained how after the Civil War and Reconstruction, there's going to be also the arrival of new industries. We talked about quite extensively in session 2 about the industries arriving into the South, like the textile industries, for example, Coca-Cola, the tobacco industries, For instance, the steel plants, okay, mining, and so on. And of course, the coming of the railroads as well. So again, Southerners are going to change the way they live because they're going to transition into now also into industries. They're going to be participating in this wage labor economy, earning wages. They're going to be creating the first large industrial cities in the South and so on. And they're going to be modernizing. Okay, we're going to see the rise of the middle class in the South very gradually and so on. Again, this is going to be, significant change from how the South was prior to this change. That was largely just an agricultural region dominated by planters, and through the use of slave labor, again, they were pretty much producing everything that the states required. And of course, there's another group, the small farmers, that pretty much lived their lives in the countryside. So all of that, again, setting is going to change very rapidly, after the Civil War with industrialization. And the South is modernizing gradually. But in part 3, in this session, what we're going to do is look at the West. And we're going to look at this region independently from the North and the South in terms of how this region actually was. Just briefly, I'm going to just take a glance at how this region was before modernization, and how this region is gradually changing as well, as it's transitioning now to a modern, civilized, if you will, life, in that this region was totally undeveloped prior to the Civil War, in that there were very few Americans actually living there. For the most part, this region that you see here in this map, called the so-called Wild West, was actually inhabited by Native American groups that were roaming around, again, this region. There were a multiplicity of different groups. And there were, of course, millions of buffaloes as well that were roaming around as well. So Americans had not yet moved into this region in a significant way to actually create territories in which we're going to see the formation of towns, for example, or settlements or enterprises of any kind. So this was not necessarily an abandoned region, but it was not developed, that is to say. Okay, so we're going to track the social and economic changes taking place in this region, and how by the turn of the century we're going to see the emergence of what is called a new American West. Okay, so again, this is the map. This just shows you specifically the region that underwent transformations as, again, Americans are moving there, particularly after 1865. At the end of the Civil War, Americans are going to be moving there by the millions, again, into this region and transforming nature, transforming the landscape, and they're going to simply, again, it's quote unquote, civilize it, that is to say. Okay, so we're going to track that civilizing, if you will, process or transformation in this session 3. Okay, so again, it shows you, the region right here, the specific region, again, that we're talking about. This is the area in question when we talk about the so-called the Wild West, because there were, at the time of the Civil War, 1860-65, some regions that were already developed. For example, Kansas became a state. Okay, around this time, we're talking about, again, Kansas really was already transitioning to statehood as early as 1855. Of course, there was a lot of conflict, of course, in terms of what kind of constitution Kansas needed to, incorporate, whether slave or free. But this region was already well developed. It was a territory that was already transitioning to statehood, and of course, Oregon and Oregon and California were already as well. Areas that Americans had already moved there. They were already settled, and so on. And they became states before the Civil War. But for the most part, when you look all over this region, the Central Plains, for example, all of this region, It was again a region that was totally yet undeveloped. It was a region inhabited by 40 Native American nations. What we mean about nations are simply, again, Native American groups that had their own distinct languages, that they had political organization that was somewhat complex in that they had certain chiefs. There was like sort of ranking system again of leaders or chiefs. In many cases, those positions were inherited positions that were transmitted from generation to generation. In many cases, they had their own established religious beliefs and practices, their own cultures, and so on. And they had norms that they lived by, what we call, for example, laws, for example, okay, that the members of those societies actually lived by. So those were considered nations. Then in some cases, although not all of them, they had certain established territories that they claimed some form of entitlements to. In other words, there were specific regions that those nations claim ancestry, in other words, that their ancestors came from this land, so they claim entitlements to the use of the resources and so on. There were also 13 million buffaloes roaming around this region. They were traveling according to the seasons, north and south, and many of those Native American nations were actually following the herds of the buffalo up and down according to the seasons, and they lived off of, again, the hunting of the buffalo. The buffalo was the main form of sustenance, again, of those Native American groups. This region, the so-called Wild West, is called wild because it's still nature in the wild, so to speak. We see also the absence of towns and cities, that is to say, with the exceptions, again, of Oregon and California. The vast majority, again, of this region is just, again, we're not going to see the presence of towns and cities. If we're going to see Americans, which there are Americans, I mean, this is not to deny that there's no Americans in the Wild West. Of course, there are Americans. But the vast majority of them are actually pioneers, people who love nature or are explorers. There's, of course, scientists in many cases. Many of those pioneers are scientists actually mapping the landscape, pretty much identifying the sources of water, the kind of soil that that prevailed in certain regions, making for notations of that, perhaps making discoveries about minerals and so on. So there are pioneers, whether we're talking about simply lovers of nature or scientists or explorers. Again, there are, again, Americans there that are simply traveling, if you will, from place to place. And in many cases, Native Americans actually assist the pioneers in those expeditions. There's, of course, the presence of Christian missionaries that are there in the Wild West for the sole purpose of spreading Christianity. They're trying to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And so that was part of the civilizing mission. Americans during this time, at least the religious communities in the United States believed that it was the duty of Christians to spread Christianity in this region, and that one way to, at the same time that you spread Christianity, and you save souls, that spreading Christianity as well serves the function of civilizing, the native, that is to say, okay, and transforming it into an American, that is to say, okay. So there's, of course, missionaries as well. There's people engaged in trade. There are trails, merchant trails, again, of people that are actually bringing goods back and forth, particularly from California, from Oregon. And there's, of course, specific trails. We're going to mention a couple of them just in a few moments here. And there's surveyors, people that are actually land developers that are really looking into, for example, real estate. So they're actually going there to pretty much understand the land, how the land can be broken up into plots and maybe invest, in that land, buy it cheaply, and then later on sell it at higher price and so on. Again, so there's also that, aspect as well. There's surveyors, and of course, something that we're very much aware, thanks to popular culture, movies in Hollywood, particularly 20th century films about the Wild West, is that we know that the Wild West was also the home of outlaws. Again, those are actually people that had pending businesses with the law in many of the formal states of the Union, particularly the eastern states. And so in order to escape the law, in many cases, there were so many different kinds of felonies, misdemeanors, and crimes that people would commit. Might be financial, might be criminal in terms of theft, or sometimes murder and such. So what they do is that they go into the Wild West. They pretty much try to live, a life outside the law. That is to say, outside civilization. At the same time. Okay, so there are Americans, but I want you to understand that this is not, a region that we're going to see prior to the Civil War. Okay, prior to the Civil War, we're not going to see development there. Okay, Americans are not yet developing that area because still the country has not yet, developed a structure again of how development was going to take place, because it was very divided. The country was very divided between the North and the South in terms of what kind of economic system are we going to bring into the Wild West. Is it going to be industrialization and farming and free labor, or is it going to be plantations and slave labor, for example? The issue of slavery, it actually tore the country apart in 1860, particularly about concerning how are we supposed to develop those territories, those lands, the Wild West. Are we going to introduce slaves there or not? Again, that produced the Civil War. So that's one of the reasons, why Americans did not move there earlier, because they were so divided, again, on how to actually go about developing that region. So I mentioned that there were two areas of the West, particularly when we talk about the West Coast, that Americans had already developed, and they already not only developed settlements and communities, but the presence of Americans there and pretty much settlers, perhaps coming from different parts of the world, are going to reach the minimum requirement for actually becoming a state. California actually becomes a state in 1850, and Oregon becomes a state in the Union in 1859. So there were already formal states before the Civil War of 1860. So what that means is that those were already, again, regions that were developed, fully developed, and not only that, but those were regions that were very productive, and that the kind of products or resources that people actually extracted or produced in either Oregon or California found markets back in the eastern states of the country. And so there were, of course, merchant trails, or trails as they were called, the California and the Oregon trails as they were known, that were formed as early as the 1840s. We're going to see the development of trails. And again, there's no railroad to speak of at this time. So we're not talking about a railroad kind of transportation system that people are actually using for trade. But rather, this is just wagons. People are actually pulling, using horses to pull carts, full of wagons, again, full of actually merchandise. And so, again, there is some form of interconnectedness with the West the West was not necessarily cut off altogether from the rest of the country. There were, again, certain commercial links, both in Oregon. This is the Oregon Trail again, and this is the California Trail, and they ran all the way to, the Midwest, okay, before the Civil War. So I want you to understand that there is some form of very slow process, if you will, of change that is taking place. Americans are moving there very slowly. The missionaries, the surveyors, the traders, for example, there's outlaws, etc. And there's merchants and so on. So we're not really talking about a totally isolated region. It's just that it's going to take some time for this region to develop. And so that's exactly what we're going to be doing here, is looking at, of course, so what actually were the steps by which this region modernized. How is it that this region, after the Civil War, was rapidly transformed by Americans, and they modernized it and they transformed the landscape. Okay, so modernizing and developing the Wild West occurred in stages, and so let us analyze those particular stages by which this region was totally developed. Okay, so number one, the first stage or the first step for developing any area, by the way, is, well, you need to move people there first. Okay, because without people, who's actually going to develop the enterprises, the economic activities that are going to actually transform the region? Okay, if you're going to develop communities or towns, well, you need to actually move as many people as you actually can, and very rapidly as well. Okay, that's the first step, and that's the first stage for transformation. We looked at that at the north, for example. How the northern cities were created. Well, migrations. People moved there to actually create a whole new social setting, and they moved there by the millions, by the way. Okay, so the same holds true for the Wild West. There's going to be significant number of peoples actually pouring in into the Wild West, particularly in the very middle of the Civil War. In the midst of the Civil War in 1862, the gates were totally open, for Americans to pour into this region by the millions, particularly Americans coming from the north. Northerners are the ones that are going to actually open the doors, and they're going to move millions of people there. Eventually Southerners are also going to be allowed to, but during the Civil War, when the South and the North were fighting, one of the reasons why the Lincoln administration, Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party in 1862 decided to open up the floodgates for massive population settlement was precisely to prevent Southerners from actually moving slavery in the Wild West. That was the reason. Look, we're fighting this middle, we're in the middle of the Civil War, we're fighting the South. So before the South gets organized and try to move people there to expand slavery, we're going to actually win the race. So again, they, just opened the doors for the massive outpouring of people. Lincoln, again, and the Republican Party controlling the Union at this point by passing the Homestead Act of 1862. So what is the Homestead Act? Well, the Homestead Act is an act of Congress that actually awarded land. Again, those are land grants, that is to say. Land grants for the purpose of creating farms. So we're going to actually create hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of new farms in the country. So this land is going to be used for farming. In other words, it's not going to be used for plantation purposes. This is not land for planters to dominate and to bring in their slaves. No, this is to actually make sure that Americans own their own land, and they're in control of their own resources, and that they're productive, and that they actually generate wealth from the land. How? Well, farming. There's going to be a need for more food to feed the growing population of the country. So let's create millions of new farms. So the Homestead Act of 1862 awarded 160 acres to what is called yeoman farmers. A yeoman farmer is an independent farmer, that is to say, to create independent farmers that are going to own, each family, 160 acres. And the purpose is that they're going to move there, develop the land, clear the land, and they're going to develop a farm. In that farm is going to serve a commercial purpose. It's not just going to be a farm that farmers are going to use to sustain their families, but rather to actually move into the market. You're going to grow food that will feed the populations of the cities, that is to say. That's a business, as an enterprise, that is to say. Okay? So from 1862, when the Homestead Act was passed, all the way to 1900, there were 600,000 families that were awarded those 160 acres in the Wild West, particularly in the central plains, and they're now moving there at a great speed, and they're transforming the land. They're creating now, eventually, again, in the initial decades of the 20th century, there will be millions, really, of new farmers, new American farmers, most of whom are actually in the Wild West. Okay, so that's first and foremost. Again, this is essential. You're now moving people there. Okay, at a great speed, and of course, the great incentive is, look, there's land, it's available, is cheap land, and this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Americans to actually own their own land and be their own boss. That is to say, you're a farmer, you're in control of your own farm. There were certain conditions, certain criteria they needed to meet. No connections to the Confederacy, no criminal record pending, for example, and if you were loyal to the Union, then you were, awarded that particular land. Okay, so that's the first wave of people that are rushing, to the Wild West. There's a land rush. Okay, that's a resource that has become available that is acting like a magnet again to human populations. So, in other words, there's a land boom, an economic boom. The resource is land, and it's attracting millions of Americans, to relocate there. Okay, so that's the opening act, again, of the population settlement. But there is another aspect of the population settlement that we have to also discuss, and that is that there's also a significant number of African Americans from the South that are going to be moving westward. We talked about the exodusters, the African Americans that went up north, after the Civil War. We talked about that in session 1, many African Americans moving up north. 10%, move up north to the cities, but 5% of African Americans moved west. They also wanted opportunities in the West. They're trying their luck also to move westward, and many of them are actually moving there in search for land. In many cases, again, they also want to own their own land, start farming. Also, many of them actually are in search for jobs, because there's going to be a lot of construction work that is going to take place in the Wild West. There's many things that need to be built, in other words, roads, bridges, houses, and the like, again. And so, in terms of construction work or many other kinds of work, African Americans are also in search for that kind of work. And of course, commerce. There's also the opportunity to, trade or buy products, let's say, from one town and then introduce it to another settlement and sell it and make money. It's called commerce, that is to say. Okay? And so there's another, again, population wave that is also moving there. So 5% of African Americans translating to more or less, give and take, anywhere between 200 to 250,000, African Americans moving to the Wild West. So that's the first step to transform the region. You're now moving a lot of people there, and there's, of course, it's not just moving people for the sake of moving them. They're incentivized to actually begin, an enterprise. It's called farming, that is to say. Okay. Number two, the second step or stage for transformation occurred through the development of commercial enterprises. So there's going to be merchants, for example, entrepreneurs, investors, financiers that are going to be moving there to actually create industries or create many kinds of different enterprises that are going to, at the same time, attract people to those regions in search for jobs. And as those enterprises are developing, attracting populations to those centers, we're going to see the creation of towns and communities, eventually cities as well, in the process. And likewise, where those enterprises actually arise is not just random. So it's not like investors and financiers, for example, decide to simply open up a mine, just anywhere. No, they're going to actually open up, for example, a mine in a region that the scientists have found certain, metals, precious metals or resources there. So again, obviously, the discoveries made by scientists and surveyors there that were trying to map the landscape for natural resources and mineral wealth, eventually that is going to lead to the creation of enterprises like mining, for example. There's going to be gold, silver, and copper mines in regions such as Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas, in those territories. We're going to see that as a result of those metals, that mineral wealth being discovered, we're going to see the development of what is called like a mining camp. Okay, and people are actually moving engineers, moving workers there to start mining, for example, copper or silver or gold. And as more people arrive, what happens is that camp is going to become a little town, so to speak, because eventually people will be living there, and there's going to be a lot of construction work. People are actually going to be building houses, lodging, for example. There's going to be, to provide accommodations, for example, cabins and so on, of various kinds. And there's going to be merchants arriving there to actually provide services like food, for example, and so on, for people that were there, or blacksmiths, pretty much forging tools and so on, providing services to the local population. So they're going to create commerce inside of that community. And eventually you're going to get a community going. Again, from a simple little mining camp, we're going to see the creation of mining towns, eventually cities. That's how the process, again, unfolded, particularly in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas, thanks to the discoveries of gold, silver, and copper. That is to say, so the development of commercial enterprises was key, again, to the development of those territories, because those enterprises were, like, as I mentioned in session 1, and I've been mentioning also in session 2 of this topic, those were actually the economic booms that were attracting people there, to those particular territories that were totally uninhabited, in many cases, not always uninhabited. But, there was no incentive for people to move there, not until there was a certain discovery, again, in which, again, an enterprise was founded, provided jobs, and that created a whole community again. So, again, this is going to be a pattern that gets repeated across human history, really, the creation of cities, again, through economic booms, that is to say. Okay, so also another enterprise that is going to be, transformative in terms of allowing people to move to areas that were previously unoccupied or unsettled or undeveloped, was cattle ranching. We were talking about the beef industry, in session one, the slaughterhouses in Chicago, for example, the meatpacking plants. We were talking about the invention of the refrigerator rail car. This is something that we talked about again in session one, leading to the beef industry in the north. And a part of the beef industry also entailed cattle ranching as well. But ranching itself, that was part of this conglomerate, this complex industry that involved many different types of industries, included cattle ranching, okay? Because that cattle ranching itself was the starting point of the beef industry. This is where you actually begin. You produce the cattle, you raise it, you graze it, you multiply it, and you actually transport it eventually to the slaughterhouses. So this is the starting point, if you will, of the beef industry. There's a growing demand for beef in the country. Americans are now consuming beef on a day-to-day basis thanks to refrigeration, and it's becoming now part of American culture, eating beef, in other words. And so because of the growing demand for beef, because there's now transportation like railroads and refrigeration, what we're going to see is that this growing demand for beef led to the development of a new industry, and this is the cattle ranching industry. Now, cattle ranching has been around for centuries, of course. This goes back really, in the United States, going back to the 1600s and 1700s. Again, so cattle ranching is not like a new development, so to speak, and of course, the Spaniards who colonized Mexico and the American Southwest, places like Texas, for example, in California, New Mexico, also introduced ranching as well, from Spain as well. Ever since the 1500s, the Spaniards introduced ranching as well, to their colonies in the Americas. But cattle ranching in the past was a small-scale type of enterprise that was only geared to provide meat products to local populations. Local, again. So one cattle ranch is going to provide beef, again, to surrounding areas. All the towns that surround, again, the ranch or a series of ranches are going to be the consumers, let's just say. Okay, so they were really rather small type of ventures or enterprises. And, that kind of small scale operation remained constant across the centuries from the 1500s all the way to the 1800s. But now, with new technologies like railroads, refrigeration, and the like, and factories, and growing cities in the United States, and so on, the coming of electricity, and so on. Again, now cattle ranching will become an industry in its own right. Okay, it will cease to be simply a family-owned, kind of enterprise in which people are simply grazing perhaps 100, maybe 200 heads of cattle, and that was pretty much it. Okay, perhaps the largest ranch prior to this time was like 500 cattle or so. Again, and that was considered monumental, by the way, to have 500 cows, for example. Okay, it was considered monumental in the past, but now forget about that. There's now a growing demand for beef, so we have to now mass produce it. In other words, we need industrial type of technologies and techniques. We need to, in other words, transform cattle ranching into a factory, like a large industry, in other words, to mass produce, to generate as many, cattle every given year, because there's, of course, there's wealth involved there. You want to actually, of course, expand your business. You want to maximize production because that maximizes gains and profits and so on. And so, again, this is a growing industry. This is growing. It's, of course, is a product of basic necessity as well. Okay, it's beef, and so the cattle ranches that are going to develop in the West are going to be developing in places like Texas, which was already a well-developed state, by the way, Kansas as well, and Colorado. Diane, this is still kind of falls in the kind of orbit of what today we simply called the Wild West, when historians refer to the Wild West, that is to say, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, the largest ranches, again, in the country and even in the world. The largest cattle ranches in the world were in Texas, again, in Texas alone, in the Panhandle region and in the Valley, in the border region with Mexico, again, what we call the southeastern portion, again, of Texas. So gigantic ranches. Again, there's going to be investors, that and financiers that are going to be buying, millions of acres of land and, grazing as many cattle as possible. And that, again, created what is called a cattle ranching boom in the United States, leading to what today we call simply industrial ranching. This is the beginning of industrial ranching. It's mass production, again, and that now people are interested in, raising and grazing hundreds of thousands, millions of cattle. Or this is, again, they're now thinking about millions, of course, because of the new technologies. And by, for example, by 1880, the Texas, Colorado, and Kansas had already produced about 6 million cattle, by just 1880 alone. And that cattle has been driven in cattle trails, if you will, to the train stations that were located particularly in places like Kansas, for example, before the railroad actually fully arrived to Texas in the late 1800s. The cattle had to be driven up north. It had to be driven to Kansas. Eventually, cattle had to be driven to the area of Dallas, Fort Worth, in the late 1800s, from which the railroad was going to now take the cattle to the slaughterhouses and the meatpacking plants located in Chicago up north, that is to say. So again, this is, again, the kind of representation of the cattle trails. Again, this is the south, what I call the valley, the southeastern part of Texas, where the largest ranches were located. So from San Antonio and Corpus Christi all the way to the border of Mexico, again, this was a gigantic cattle region per excellence. Again, so all the cattle will be driven up north, once again, to the train stations located in Kansas, and it will be taken to Chicago. So from Chicago, those animals are slaughtered and they're packaged, the beef that is, and then they're going to be transported all over the country. Okay, all over the country. So again, cattle ranching was not necessarily just a kind of ordinary type of enterprise, because this has to be considered as an industry. Okay, that is going to bring jobs. In other words, this is going to attract a lot of people. In other words, to move, whether we're talking about Texas or Kansas or Colorado, and again, in search for work. And there will be, again, an incentive for Americans and also for Mexicans, again, people coming from Mexico, also to be moving into the United States in search for work, particularly in the cattle industry. Okay, and something we can actually look at in just a few minutes, from now. Okay, so so far, mining, cattle ranching were key commercial enterprises that are developing this region. And besides those, we're going to see also farming, agricultural companies as well. Farming and agricultural companies. Again, those are going to be additional enterprises that are going to also develop in a very significant way certain regions of the West, particularly the most productive ones like California and Texas again. There's going to be Americans that are going to be moving there to develop what is called commercial farming, okay, in terms of not just owning the land to sustain themselves and their families. When we talk about California and Texas, there's going to be a lot of people that are also already moving into the market because the opportunity is now presented to farmers in the West, from whatever region you're moving into, that now the railroad is now arriving, is being developed all over the country, and there's now the possibility for you to actually ship your product to another city, to another region. You have now a national market. Okay, farmers are forgetting about the limited markets of the past in which your consumers were only the nearby community surrounding your farm. Now you have the possibility of shipping your product all over the country. It's called a national market, that is to say. And because those states, California and Texas, were highly productive in terms of the population makeup, it's already very well developed. And there's also investors already, again, in those regions trying to actually create very productive, very profitable enterprises. And because the soil and the climate are very suitable for agriculture, okay, all combined, what we're going to see is that there's going to be investors that are going to now create large agricultural companies, again, in which they're going to buy thousands of acres and actually clear the land, develop the land, invest heavily in irrigation systems, for example. They're going to invest in machinery, bringing in tractors, technology, agricultural machinery, that is to say, and fertilizers and the like. And what they're going to be doing is mass producing cash crops. Okay, agricultural companies are going to now engage, just like cattle ranching, engage in mass production. There's also going to be the intense effort to mass produce cash crops that are going to find markets all over the country. Like, for example, they're going to be producing things like cotton, vegetables of many kinds, and also citrus as well. Okay, citrus, particularly in California. Again, citrus are going to be, of course, one of the dominant, cash crops of California. The citrus, sugar beets as well, and all sorts of vegetables as well. So those are, again, produced by large companies owned by a group of investors. And so that also provides yet another enterprise that is going to incentivize, of course, migrations of people moving there in search for work. And so, again, enterprises, the creation of enterprises is really key in the transformation of any region, of any country that is moving towards what we call modernity. That is to say, that is modernizing. Okay. All right, so that's the second stage. The first stage was population settlement. The second stage was the development of commercial enterprises like mining, cattle ranching, and agricultural companies and farming. And the third stage for developing this region and modernizing is transportation itself. Okay, transportation systems, that is to say. So I mentioned the railroad revolution. I've been actually making reference to it, ever since we started this topic in session 1, in session 2. The development of railroads, for example, is key. And the West could not possibly advance in a significant way if you're trying to transform it, if you're trying to civilize it or modernize it, if there's no transportation systems. Because indeed, you can move millions of people there, you can start enterprises, but you need transportation system that is efficient, that is effective, that is industrial based as well, that is going to allow for all the products and resources that are being generated or extracted from the West to be shipped to the factories, to the manufacturing plants located in the eastern part of the country. The eastern part of the country is this is the region that has now fully developed industries. So you have to, if you are to tie the country together commercially, so the country can function as a single entity, well, you need to link the western territories with the eastern part of the country so they become fully integrated economically and commercially. So producers now in the West producing cattle or agricultural products, or they're mining, for example, minerals or metals, they have now the opportunity, the ability now to ship their products, their resources to the east so they can be processed into finished goods, or so consumers, most people in the United States live in the eastern part of the country, so consumers can actually have access to those resources as well. Okay, so the development of transportation systems occurred through the development or the passing of a congressional legislation, otherwise known as the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. In 1862, Congress, this is the same year when Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862 to award land grants to, eventually millions of American farmers in the West. So it is in the same year that also Congress, in the Union, in this case, there's in the midst of the Civil War, realized that in order to really fully transform this region and link those territories with the East, you need to bring the railroads. In other words, look, you need to develop the railroads. So let's create then an act of Congress, as a piece of legislation that is going to commission a series of railroad companies. It's actually going to create those railroad companies that are going to be given certain projects. Each railroad company is going to be given a certain territory to actually build railroads that will reach the Pacific coast, okay, the Pacific Ocean, the West Coast, what we call the West Coast. That's the Pacific Ocean, okay? So the Northern Pacific was meant to build a rail line to unite the Midwest, places like Chicago, for example, all the way to Oregon, okay, across the north, okay, so it's geographical, okay, the Northern Pacific, the Union and Central Pacifics across the mid-section of the United States to reach, again, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, particularly California, and of course the Southern Pacific to go along the southern border with Mexico, again, to build a railroad that will also unite all of the borderlands, again, all of the border region of the United States, what is called the American Southwest, going all the way to California as well with the American South, the Old South, that is to say, or the New South. We talked about the New South in this case, okay? So, again, this is, roughly speaking, again, this is the map that shows you the lines of railroad development of the Northern Pacific across the north, the Union and Central Pacific along the midsection of the country, and the Southern Pacific, again, going on along the southern border, okay, with Mexico as well. There are four. And again, this is going to, of course, take time. This is not to say that those railroads are going to be built in a few years, but railroad construction was extremely accelerated in that in 1867, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacifics actually completed the very first, what is called transcontinental railroad in 1867, when both of those railroad companies actually met their rail lines in Utah, in Promontory, Utah, in 1867. So again, in 1867, now there is one rail line that Americans can take from the East Coast, from anywhere in the East Coast, in the Eastern Seaboard. They can board a train and they can go to California, okay? from 1867 onwards, now Americans have a means of transportation to reach the West Coast. Again, so this is it's called the Transcontinental Railroad. What is Transcontinental Railroad? Is the railroad that connected the continent. Again, the entire continental landmass of the United States from east to west, that is to say. This is the first time that is going to be now a modern transportation system that Americans can take in order to travel, to relocate, to vacation, or to invest, you name it. So if you need to travel to the West, in the past, people needed either to walk or ride a horse or a couch, etc. It was very troublesome, by the way, in the past to move westward because there's so many dangers along the way. Okay, the climate, for example, was an impediment in many cases. It can be very cold, it can be very hot, desert-like, and so on. There were, animals of all kinds. There were outlaws, all of that, of course. And you need to actually, of course, that could obstruct your progress if you're trying to move westward and relocate. But now the railroad is going to even accelerate even further the movements of Americans into this region. Again, this is Promontory, Utah, where the Union Pacific that was building the railroad west from Omaha, Nebraska, met the Central Pacific Railroad that was building the railroad from Sacramento, California, moving to the east, and those lines actually met there. And now, again, we got the entire United States interconnected. Okay, so this is, historical. There was great celebration during this time because now this ushered a new era in the United States, the era of the railroad, the era of mass transportation, okay, mass movements of people. Again, particularly in a region that was not, inhabited by Americans. Now, there's going to be now a heavy presence again of more and more Americans coming in. Now, of course, the fourth stage of modernization and economic development of the Wild West, we already talked about, three, which again, just kind of recapturing everything, population settlement was one. The second involved the creation of commercial enterprises, okay? And the third, modern transportation system, the railroad. Those were essential stages of change. And so the fourth stage for transformation occurred with the development of immigrant communities. So we're going to see also the presence now of immigrant groups pouring into the Wild West in specific places. And we're not really talking about again that unlike the North, again, that received 25 million European immigrants in a 50-year period from 1870 to 1920. This is not going to be that significant, but nonetheless, we are going to see this process of foreign immigrants, particularly coming from places like Mexico and China. Again, there's going to be a significant number of Mexicans, of course, Mexican immigration to what is called the American Southwest. Okay, that is going to contribute to the further development of this region. Again, so the American Southwest is this region you can see here. Some are in just plain red, others in kind of brownish, and this striped kind of reddish, of course, region. Altogether, this region constitutes actually a geographical area in the United States identified as the Southwest. Those are states that, historically speaking, were colonized by Spain, okay, back in the 15 and 1600s. The Spaniards arrived, again, to this region when they came from Europe, and, they colonized not only Mexico, but they went up north as well. This was the Mexican, again, it was the Spanish frontier. It was called the Spanish frontier. And the Spaniards, developed a series of settlements, of course. They introduced cattle ranching, mining into this region, developed religious missions to Christianize the natives that were living here, of course. So this was historically part of Spain. And then when Mexico broke off from Spain, the independence again from Spain by Mexico achieved in 1821. This was also temporarily for about 15 or 16 years, again, part of Mexico as well. So there was also, again, the presence of not only the descendants of the Spaniards, but also Mexicans, again, that were already living here. But when the United States acquired this region from Mexico in 1848, it's called the Southwest, there were only 100,000 Mexicans living across this region. So from Texas all the way to California, there was only 100,000 Mexicans by the time that this becomes part of the U.S. But from 1848, okay, to onwards, again, we're going to see an increase of the population, the Mexican Americans, of course, population as a result of immigration. That is to say, particularly the immigration that we're referring to here took place in the years between 1870 to 1920. Particularly, again, this was the year that we're going to see 3 million Mexicans crossing the border and moving into places like particularly Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, particularly those regions, particularly those states. What were the reasons? The push factors is that there's a lot of turmoil, instability in Mexico. Okay, the Mexican Revolution exploded. It was like a civil war, really, from 1910 to 1919. And there's a lot of violence in Mexico, and that's one of the reasons why many of them decided to leave the country. But the pull factors, in other words, what was really pulling Mexicans into the United States was labor shortages, particularly in the enterprises I discussed, particularly in the copper mines, again, of New Mexico and Arizona. There's the copper mines there, the agricultural companies in Texas and in California. That require agricultural labor, and at the same time, cattle ranching. Okay, cattle ranching again is something that was very attractive to Mexicans, and of course, cattle ranchers in Texas, particularly in Texas, but also in Colorado, were convinced that Mexicans were bringing a lot of skills. Particularly in this type of activity, precisely because in Mexico, cattle ranching was perhaps the dominant type of enterprise or economic activity, again, in the country of Mexico. By far, cattle ranching has been central to the lives of Mexicans ever since the Spaniards brought it from Spain in the 1500s and 1600s. And again, most Mexicans lived nearby or grew in many cases inside of ranches. So that's why they were so so skilled in cattle ranchers' value, particularly in Texas, the labor of Mexicans in cattle ranching. And so so at any rate, so in terms of the type of activities, once again, is agriculture, mining, and ranching. They're going to be actually employed there. They're going to be paid wages. There's the wage laborers inside of those particular enterprises. And there's yet another very important development here when we talk about Mexican immigration, into the Southwest, is the creation of their own ethnic communities. That is to say, this is something we have been talking about in this particular topic, whether we were talking about the North or the South, the ethnic communities in the northern cities by Italians and Germans and Greeks congregating together, or in the South, the African American community. Likewise, what we see here is a similar pattern in that Mexicans, as they're migrating in groups, large groups of families and so on, what they're actually doing is that they're actually congregating in many cases, although not always, based on getting together with people that came with you or that came from the same part of Mexico that you came from. Okay, so they're going to create what is called a colonia. A Mexican colonia, again, is really a Mexican community inside of the United States in which the people that live there are actually immigrants or descendants of immigrants that actually came from the same part of Mexico, whether it was from a northern region of Mexico or in the south part of Mexico. So what they're doing is pretty much living together to recreate their own environment, their own cultural and social environment. They try to build the same type of architectural designs from their homes, the way they live back in Mexico. They preserve their languages, their folk traditions, their religions, their medicinal, beliefs about medicine, coming from spirits and so on. They have herbalists, for example, herbalist doctors that heal with spells and all of that. This is what you will find again in the United States. The creation was called a Mexican colonia. Okay, very prominent in places like Texas, California, and also New Mexico. It's very visible. There's also, of course, the presence of Chinese immigrants coming to the West Coast, particularly to California. We're going to see about 300,000 Chinese immigrants coming in the late 19th century in search for jobs, in search for work that they found in the railroad industries. And we're talking about the railroad companies, the Pacific Railroads. They were actually hiring Chinese labor for the construction, for the building of the railroad. So a great many ended up, again, working for railroad companies in railroad construction. And likewise, we see, just like all the ethnic groups, the foreign immigrant groups that we have talked about, we're going to see also the Chinese creating their own communities called Chinatowns, and that they are going to recreate the kind of town that they lived in back in China, almost identical. There will be almost, no way that you can actually distinguish, a Chinatown, let's say, in places like San Francisco, for example, from the kind of town from which those immigrants actually came from. The entire atmosphere, the entire architecture, the designs, the language, the foods, the attire, it's going to be pretty much the religion. It's going to be very much, again, Chinese, that it made them feel like they were still in China, like they're still, at home, that is to say. Okay, it's part of this cultural survival, trying to survive, in other words, in an environment that is alien or foreign to them. Again, it's part of what we already talked about. Now, there's a fifth, change or transformation that took place, again, that it has to be assessed, when we talk about, so we still have some minutes here. So when we talk about the Wild West, we also have to talk about the Native Americans that actually inhabited this region prior to Americans moving in to transform the landscape and trying to create settlements and enterprises, communities, etc. Okay? Because, as I mentioned in the introduction of this topic, the Wild West was inhabited by over 40 Native American nations. Back then, of course, in the 19th century, people referred to them as Indian nations or Indian tribes, but the proper way to address, of course, the societies, the groups that inhabited this region prior not only to the coming of Americans, but even to the coming of the Europeans, period, like the Spaniards and so on, to North America. The proper way to actually address them is by calling them, of course, Native Americans, because those are the native or indigenous, if you will, groups that inhabited the the continent of America again prior to the coming of Columbus, and that have lived in the continent for thousands of years, since time immemorial, since people can actually remember. All right, so those groups, okay, which could be identified living in nations, that is to say, that they have their, distinct languages, they have their political organization that was very well structured and established. They have also specialized groups that some of them were hunters, others were warriors, others were, gatherers, medicine men, and so on. Some of them were artisans and the like, and they have their own norms, their own laws that they were guided by, their own religions. Those groups actually entered the age of modernity in their own way. In other words, the livelihood of those 40 Indian nations, so to speak, once again, you can actually categorize them into nations that were very distinct. That you can actually see, you can track, again, changes taking place among those groups as they were actually changing the way they have traditionally lived in this region for not only centuries, but for thousands of years, that is to say. And how they actually modernize is by moving into what is called sedentary or nested stationary communities, living together in certain regions on a permanent basis, and now recreating their society in a whole different way, in which they're going to have to learn how to actually produce food in a different way and live together again in stationary station communities, that is to say. And the way that happened is through the coming of what is called the reservation, okay? By them actually now congregating again in certain regions, in certain locations, to live in nested communities again. It was during this time required for them to move again into what is called the Native American reservation. That's how they are going to experience this modernization process that Americans were going through in a whole different way. The lives of Americans were changing as well, as they were transitioning from being farmers, from living in the countryside, to now moving to cities, working in factories, working in industries, working for wages, in other words. So Americans were going through that change, but the way Native Americans experienced this change was not necessarily to move to a city and get a job in a factory and start earning their lives through the payment of wages, but rather to move to the reservation. The reservation was their way of actually adapting or changing or modernizing to kind of conform to the kind of changes that Americans were going through at a national level, that is to say. Okay? So the reservation itself, again, is their new social setting. This is the most visible type of change that they're going to actually undergo. Okay, so most of those Native American nations lived, again, in this region you can see here called the Great Plains, although many of the Native American groups that were also moving to reservations lived, of course, in other regions outside of the Great Plains as well. Okay, particularly in the northwest part of the country, there's a number of Native American groups that also were moving to reservations as well. So it is really, again, those 40 nations that I just described are nations that lived all across this region. Again, most of whom depended on the buffalo for their survival, where it's called subsistence. They subsisted from the buffalo. They were, hunters, hunters and gatherers. Many of those societies were actually moving from place to place, following the buffalo, which was the source of food, that is to say. So they were following the food supply, that is to say. And because the buffalo actually migrates with the seasons, up, it goes up north when there is spring and summer, pursuing the more kind of the cooler, climates up north. But during fall and winter, when it gets very, very cold up north, the buffalo moves to the south, kind of escaping the cruel winters of the north, that is to say. So it migrates south during the fall and the winter, and back and forth. This is, again, a yearly, seasonal kind of pattern. So those Native American groups were actually doing that. They're kind of following the buffalo up and down, if you will, for thousands of years. Okay, they have been doing that, by the way. Okay, so that was their livelihood, by the way. It was their way of life, that is to say. Okay, so let's see how that way of life is going to change and look at the reasons why the reservation is going to become such a, perhaps a necessary, if you will, change for those Native American groups to actually survive, as we'll see, that the survival of those societies and those cultures, as we'll see, in just a few minutes, is going to be made possible really by the reservation itself. Okay, something we're gonna get there. I'm just kind of building a case here. Why the reservation actually helped those societies actually survive as a group and as a culture. Okay, so, why the reservation is going to be so necessary is because, of course, there's going to be, a clash, between the Native American groups and the newcomers. With the Homestead Act, there's hundreds of thousands of families that are moving into this region. They're being awarded land. They're, clearing the land, establishing their own farms, the homesteaders, as they were called. And in many cases, what happens is that Native Americans who have been roaming around quite freely, up and down, and so on, are now facing this issue which is called private property. That is to say, there's private property domain. People are actually fencing their properties with barbed wire and so on. And in many cases, the buffaloes destroy those fences as well. And Native Americans are simply raiding, if you will, properties. They're pursuing the buffaloes. And there's, of course, confrontation between the homesteaders and the Native Americans over issues of what is called private property. That is to say, because that land was simply just open range in the past for them. So now the institution of private property is pretty much changing. How people actually, see the landscape. The landscape is not just open range. There's private property domains, in other words. So there's an issue with that. There's also, of course, mining regions, particularly in places like Oklahoma and the Dakotas, that have been ancestral lands of Native American groups that have lived there for thousands of years, and then in many cases they buried their ancestors, their family members, deceased family members there, and they create in those burial sites a sort of sacred ceremonial center that people visit for rituals and so on. And so as we see the development of mining enterprises, what we're going to see is that many of those mining regions ended up absorbing part of those burial sites and so on. And so there's going to be a clash, of course. The Indians refuse to leave those mining regions precisely because of their ancestors being buried there, because they visit those places for ceremonies to contact their ancestors and so on. And that, of course, create clashes as well, okay, between the Native Americans and the settlers, again, particularly the mining towns and so on. There's conflict, of course. The buffaloes, of course, there are 13 million buffaloes that are roaming around. I just talk about how they destroy the barbed wire of some of the fences of the homesteaders. And the same holds true for cattle ranches as well. Cattle ranchers are also going to, suffer from the same type of issue by the buffaloes, but also the railroads. The railroads at the same time are slowed down or damaged by the buffaloes, because when they cross, there's hundreds of buffaloes. Again, there's a whole huge herd, again, that is just roaming around or running away, or they feel frightened, etc. And so when they run, they pretty much devastate anything that stands in their path. And so that includes the railroad tracks. Even wagons are totally damaged, by those buffalo herds as well. Okay, so that actually slows down transportation, or in many cases interrupt the transportation, because it was going to take weeks before the railroad tracks are repaired and so on. So again, it's pretty much slowing down, if you will, commerce. So that's another thing. And of course, I just mentioned, the cattle ranchers are also, complaining that their cattle, are totally devastated, or they lose cattle. Hundreds, thousands of cows might be totally lost when the buffaloes come in and destroy the fences, the barbed wire, quite easily, by the way. And of course, the cattle escapes. The cattle rancher is totally oblivious to that incident, because again, this is a large industrial ranch that person owns, and that again, they lose capital, they lose investment. It's going to be very difficult to to recover all of those animals that they just lost, in other words. So this again, so enterprises, there's property owners, there's farmers, settlers that are now complaining that, look, we need to perhaps, teach the Native Americans how to actually grow their own food in a different way. Maybe turn them into farmers, in other words, that instead of hunting for the buffalo, that maybe what we need to do is actually, kind of move them into communities, farming communities, maybe transform them into farmers, that is to say, so they can farm, grow their own food, in a whole different, so they can actually, so they can generate their own food in a whole different way. Okay, so again, so what is going to, push the Native Americans into the reservation is precisely that the food supply, this source of nourishment and sustenance that had sustained the livelihood of those Native American groups for thousands of years, is going to almost become extinct, is going to almost disappear, that is to say. The buffalo population is going to almost become extinct. From 13 million, that existed in 1850, we're going to see just a few thousands left by 1880. Again, this is just mind-boggling. This is how, the transition was made possible, because, the whole culture of the Native Americans was based on the buffalo itself. The movement, the migrations, the rituals that they performed to the buffalo, the dances they performed to the buffaloes. The entire culture was based on the buffalo itself. So when the buffalo disappeared, there was now the need, of course, to develop an alternative source of survival, a different economic strategy for survival, that is to say, that is going to entail farming, that is to say. So how that process came about is with the commercialization of the buffalo hide. In other words, that the hide of the buffalo, or today we simply call it the leather, in other words, leather products, again, for making things like coats and belts, boots, hats, and so on. So many different, again, attires, many different clothing items and products made from the hide of the buffalo became very appealing, very attractive to Americans. People are now demanding, those kinds of products. So that created a demand. And so once you have a demand, of course, there's going to be a growing enterprise or industry that is going to supply it, that is to say. So again, that led to the commercialization of the buffalo hide. There is an industry like the so-called leather industry that is now sending, of course, hunters. There's a lot of thousands of hunters moving to the Wild West just for the whole purpose of hunting the buffalo, removing the hide, leaving the carcass or the corpse to rot, and pretty much selling the hide to the merchants that had certain meeting stations, in which they were simply receiving the hides and paying the hunters for it. In other words, so that led to the devastation of the buffalo, which was the main source of sustenance and subsistence and religion. The whole culture of those Native American societies, again, was based on the buffalo itself. It was the buffalo was the god, the main god in many cases of many of those societies. So again, 13 million buffaloes were killed between 1850 and 1880. This was the so-called the extermination of the American buffalo or bison. By 1889, there were just a few thousand left. Perhaps anywhere between 5 to 10,000 buffaloes were left, by 1889. So again, this is a dramatic, decrease of an animal species that was one of the dominant species of the central of the Central Plains of the United States that have existed for thousands of years, and that was really again the basis for the culture, for the societies of those groups that have for thousands of years pretty much created their own distinct cultures as well. Okay, this is the region from which, again, the buffalo roam. It was heavily present, again, in this region here in pink, and the Central Plains. And it was totally devastated, again, by hunting. And hunting that was only geared for getting the hide and not really the beef or the meat of that animal. That was also extremely important, again, for a lot of Native Americans. Native Americans actually hunted the buffalo, but they use all parts of the buffalo. They consume the beef, and they use every part to make clothing for their teepees or houses that were mobile as well, etc. Okay, so again, this is just piles, again, of buffalo hides that were brought, let's say, by a few hunters that they collected their money, by the merchants or investors that were there, the agents. And again, they were pretty much manufactured, they were processed into clothing, that is to say. So that led to the reservation itself. Why? Because Native Americans, realized, the chiefs, the Native American chiefs just realized that there's no way that they can actually continue their livelihood without the buffalo. There's no way. Their main source of nourishment is gone. So they need to adapt to another lifestyle, to another culture. Okay? Not necessarily to change their culture, but their buffalo-based culture can no longer continue, that is to say. Okay? So they need to transition from hunting into farming, that is to say. Okay, and so that led to the reservation itself, and the second process, again, after the devastation of the buffalo comes the reservation. In 1851, just to give you an idea here, in 1851 there were proposals for reservation that the U.S. government officials met Indian tribes again to actually talk about reservation proposals. It was declined because still there were 13 million. In 1851, 13 million buffaloes. But by the 1880s, there were just a few thousand left, few thousand buffaloes. So therefore, those reservation proposals are now accepted, and Congress passed a law to actually create it's called the Indian Reservation, called the Dawes Severalty Act again in 1887, by which now Congress is going to award territories or lands to more than 40 Indian nations for the purpose of them actually controlling their own land and actually moving there in order to actually subsist now in that space, that is to say. Okay, so now that the Native Americans are now moving into the reservation, in this transition, it was very difficult for them. what is going to happen is that many Native Americans are, shocked to leave their lives behind, their memories, many of their ancestors that they have buried in many places of the regions from which they actually inhabited. Okay, many of them, their ancestors were buried again in mountains or in caves and certain burial grounds, and so they felt that they were going to lose their connection to their ancestors because they were moved now into reservations that had no, in many cases, none of those burial sites, of course. Okay, so what is going to happen is that there's going to be an Indian religious revival all across this region, the West, after the creation of the reservation, that the Native American chiefs actually created this Indian revivalism, this religious revivalism, again, as a way to the last attempt to revive Native culture, in other words. So what is this Indian revivalism? Why is it that this Indian religious revival intended to revive Native American culture? Well, as Native Americans are moving to reservations, they said, look, if we forget about who we are, as a group, if we forget our links to the past, where we come from, who are our ancestors, we're looking at the possibility that we're going to be totally transformed and change, as a group. In other words, that we're going to lose our ethnic and cultural identity. So in 1890, their solution to that is to remember and worship their ancestors inside of the Indian reservation. So instead of going to those burial sites, they said, instead of actually going there, we're actually going to honor our ancestors now in a whole new way. We're going to create dances, in other words, inside of the reservation to actually remember our ancestors. Because by remembering our ancestors, we're going to actually, reaffirm who we are as a group. We're going to actually reassert our language, our traditions, our religion, our history, our entire history. We're going to bring it back, in other words. This religious revival movement was known in 1890 as the Ghost Dance movement. Ghost Dance. Why it was called Ghost Dance is because the Native American chiefs reported that their ancestors were coming back in spirit form to tell them, you have to remember who you are by always keeping the memory of your ancestors alive in dances, in other words. Okay, so ancestor spirits were appearing in dreams or in visions to the Native American chiefs, saying you have to create some form of ancestor worship. That is to say, inside of the reservation, that is going to actually help all of the community remember your roots, remember where you come from, that you have a history, in other words, that your group is very unique, very distinct, because you're coming from a specific group of people that gave you the culture, that is to say. So it was called Ghost Dance because, outsiders that did not know anything about ancestor spirits, they said, oh, so their ancestor spirits are coming back. Well, those are ghosts. In other words, that Native Americans are talking about ghosts, in other words, that the ghosts of the ancestors are coming to them, telling them that they have to perform dances of ancestor worship, that is to say, that they're reporting the return of the ancestors in dreams, that the ancestors are returning in visions, to tell them that you have to revive and preserve the old religion now in the reservation by, paying homage to your own ancestors. Of course, this is the way you're going to survive as a culture. Your community is going to retain your specific ethnic and cultural identity by remember your roots, in other words. Okay, so the reservation itself, as I said, was really the positive, aspect of the reservation, was that it really provided a space for Native Americans to actually preserve their heritage, to preserve their culture, that otherwise, if there was no land given to them, there was no reservation, no territory given to them, The possibility was that those groups were going to disband. They were going to simply, they will be broken up into different, sections, and some members will move up north, others are going to be moving south. So the whole society was going to be disintegrated. Therefore, the possibility of actually saving that culture, that language, that religion was going to be more difficult as the members are simply being disbanded. But if you bring all those people together to live together in a single community, then it becomes much easier for that group to actually preserve the culture, because when people live together, pretty much they preserve the language, the norms, the traditions, the religion, because they live together. They help each other. They reinforce each other, their sense of self, as a group, in other words. Okay, so that's the positive, again, aspect of the reservation. So again, this is the end of this topic. The questions are found below. You can scroll all the way to the very bottom, of the document. You're going to find the study questions that will appear on the exam. Okay, so this is all I have for you, and this is the end again of this topic. This is the end of session 3. I'll see you then in session 1 of the next topic when we come back. Thank you.